Hey guys, tonight we're easing into something a little more modern than medieval castles or deeply related cousins marrying each other for land rights. So go ahead and dim the lights. Put your phone face down, let the world politely wait. Tonight, we're drifting into the long, slow unraveling of a presidency. The kind of unraveling that happens not with swords or poison goblets, but with tape recorders, bad decisions, and a truly heroic level of self-sabotage. This is the story of Watergate, or more specifically, the story of the only American president who looked at the job, sighed deeply, and then resigned it. Because, of course he did. So let's begin, gently, with Richard Nixon, a man who spent his entire life convinced that everyone was out to get him, which ironically became true largely because of how intensely he believed it. Richard Nixon was not born into wealth, not born into glamour, not born into the kind of effortless charm that makes people forgive your mistakes. He was born in California, raised in a strict Quaker household, and carried with him for the rest of his life the emotional vibe of a man who never quite felt invited to the party but showed up anyway, standing in the corner, silently judging everyone. He was awkward, intensely awkward, the kind of awkward that doesn't soften with age, but instead calcifies into resentment. Nixon was smart, disciplined, and ambitious, but he lacked that magical quality that makes people relax around you. John F. Kennedy had it. Lyndon Johnson could bully it into existence. Nixon just didn't, and he knew it. This knowledge sat with him. It marinated. It fermented. Over decades, it turned into a worldview where loyalty was rare, enemies were everywhere, and victory justified absolutely everything, especially the weird stuff. Nixon's early political career was built on suspicion. He made his name chasing communists in the late 1940s and early 1950s, riding the Red Scare like a surfboard straight into national attention. He learned early that fear worked, accusations worked, aggression worked, and so he kept using them. By the time he became vice president under Dwight Eisenhower, Nixon was already deeply familiar with the idea that politics was a dirty business, full of liars, traitors, and backstabbers. He wasn't entirely wrong, but he also wasn't exactly helping. Then came 1960. Nixon ran for president against JFK and lost, narrowly, painfully. Televised debates didn't help. Kennedy looked relaxed and tan. Nixon looked sweaty and tense, like he'd been trapped in a malfunctioning elevator with his own thoughts. That loss stuck with him, deeply. 8 years later, after Kennedy was assassinated, after Lyndon Johnson burned himself out on Vietnam, Nixon finally got what he wanted, the presidency. At last, validation, proof, he had won. And yet, instead of relaxing, Nixon immediately became more paranoid. Because why wouldn't he? By the early 1970s, the United States was tired. Vietnam had dragged on forever. Protesters were everywhere. Trust in government was eroding. Nixon, now president, believed the country was under siege, not just from foreign enemies, but by journalists, political rivals, activists, and probably some interns he didn't recognize. To Nixon, dissent wasn't just annoying, it was dangerous, and dangerous things needed to be controlled. This is where we gently drift toward Watergate itself, slowly, calmly, no sudden movements. The Nixon administration was obsessed with leaks. Someone, somewhere, was always talking. Papers were being published, secrets were escaping. The most infamous example was the Pentagon Papers, which exposed years of government lies about Vietnam. Nixon hadn't even been responsible for most of it, but he took it personally anyway. Of course he did. So Nixon and his inner circle decided they needed protection, not security in the normal sense, but proactive, creative protection, the kind that involved burglary, surveillance, and a group of operatives charmingly nicknamed the Plumbers. Yes, the Plumbers. Their job was to plug leaks, metaphorically, and sometimes literally breaking into places, because subtlety was not their strong suit. By 1972, Nixon was running for re-election, and despite his anxiety, he was actually doing very well. The Democratic opposition was fragmented, the economy wasn't terrible, Nixon was, by most metrics, likely to win comfortably, which makes what happens next especially impressive in a deeply unnecessary way. On the night of June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. They were not supposed to be there. They were very obviously not supposed to be there, and they were carrying wiretapping equipment, cameras, and large amounts of cash. This was not a subtle operation. At first, it looked like a weird but minor crime, a burglary. Strange, yes, but nothing presidential. Nixon's team immediately went into damage control mode, brushing it off as just some overzealous supporters. No big deal. And here's the thing. It might have worked. This is one of the most quietly tragic elements of the entire story. Nixon didn't need to do any of this. He was going to win. He did win, in a landslide, actually, 49 states, absolute domination. But Nixon couldn't stop himself. Behind the scenes, he was already involved in covering up the burglary, using campaign funds to pay hush money, leaning on the CIA to pressure the FBI to back off, all while insisting repeatedly that he was not a crook, which historically is never a sentence that works out well. As journalists began poking around, particularly at the Washington Post, the story refused to die. Names surfaced, connections emerged, money trails appeared, and slowly, very slowly, the burglary turned into a scandal. Nixon watched all of this unfold from the Oval Office, increasingly agitated. He taped his conversations obsessively, every meeting, every aside, a habit he believed would protect him, a record, he thought, of his leadership. This was not correct. Those tapes would eventually become the most damning evidence against him, not because they revealed some grand villain monologue, but because they showed a man casually discussing obstruction of justice like it was just another Tuesday. No dramatic music, no shouting, just quiet, bureaucratic corruption, which somehow made it worse. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in this first stretch of our slow descent, Nixon is still president, still powerful, still convinced he can outmaneuver everyone. The burglars are caught. The story is simmering, and Nixon, instead of stepping back, is leaning in. Because when you've spent your whole life believing everyone is against you, admitting fault feels impossible. Safer to double down. Always double down. So, as we drift into the early months after the break-in, keep in mind that the tragedy of Watergate isn't just the crime itself. It's the mindset, the insecurity, the endless need for control. Nixon wasn't undone by his enemies. He was undone by the quiet voice in his own head, whispering that he could never trust anyone, not even himself. And with that thought gently hovering in the air, let's float onward. Because the tapes are recording, the investigators are circling, and the president, for the first time, is beginning to realize that this might not just go away if he ignores it hard enough. But that's for the next part. For now, breathe, settle in. History is taking its time. All right, let's ease back in. Same dim lights, same low volume, the kind where you can still hear the hum of the room. When we left off, Richard Nixon was freshly re-elected, feeling victorious, and absolutely convinced that the Watergate break-in was a small, annoying problem that could be managed into oblivion. Which, historically speaking, is never how these things go. By early 1973, the burglars were no longer just burglars, they were defendants. And defendants, inconveniently, tend to talk when faced with prison. Especially when the hush money runs out, which it did, quickly, because silence is expensive. Inside the White House, Nixon's mood was not great. He oscillated between confidence and despair, often within the same conversation. One minute he was assured everything would blow over. The next, he was convinced the entire federal government was conspiring against him, including parts of his own administration, including people he had personally hired, because of course they were. At the center of this growing unease was the investigation. The FBI kept digging, congressional committees began sniffing around, and the press refused to let the story die, especially two reporters whose names would become permanently fused to the scandal, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein. They weren't flashy, they weren't dramatic, they just kept asking questions, quietly, relentlessly, which is honestly the most terrifying kind of journalism. As details leaked out, a pattern emerged. The burglars weren't rogue weirdos, they were connected to Nixon's campaign, to intelligence agencies, to a broader culture of surveillance and sabotage that had been normalized inside the administration. And Nixon knew this, because Nixon was part of it. This is where one of the most calmly disastrous decisions in American political history begins to matter. Nixon had installed a taping system in the Oval Office, and in his private study, and in other rooms. The system recorded automatically. No switch to flip, no reminder beep, just hours and hours of tape rolling in the background. Nixon thought this was brilliant. He believed the tapes would serve as proof of his intentions, proof of his leadership, proof that he hadn't done anything wrong. Which is a very bold belief to hold while actively discussing how to obstruct justice. As the Senate Watergate Committee began its public hearings in mid-1973, Americans watched daytime television in a kind of collective daze. Former aides testified, details spilled out, names were named, and slowly the scandal climbed closer to the Oval Office. One of the most important witnesses was John Dean, Nixon's own counsel. Dean was young, nervous, and increasingly aware that he was about to become the fall guy, so he did the unthinkable in Nixon's world. He told the truth. Dean testified that there had been a cover-up, that Nixon had been involved, that conversations had taken place about paying off the burglars and blocking investigations. It was a devastating moment, not because it was loud or theatrical, but because it was calm, matter-of-fact, almost apologetic. Nixon watched from the White House, fuming. And then came the bombshell, almost by accident. During testimony, it was revealed that Nixon recorded his conversations. Tapes, actual recordings. Suddenly, everything changed, because testimony can be argued, memories can be questioned. But tapes? Tapes just sit there, patient, unblinking. The Senate immediately demanded them. Nixon refused. He claimed executive privilege. He argued that releasing the tapes would endanger national security, which was a bit rich considering they mostly contained conversations about political enemies, petty grievances, and how much Nixon disliked basically everyone. What followed were months of legal maneuvering. Court cases, appeals, delays, Nixon fighting time itself, hoping the public would get bored, hoping something else would happen, hoping maybe that reality would lose interest. It did not. Inside the White House, Nixon grew darker. He drank more, he paced, he ranted. His conversations, captured on tape, revealed a man obsessed with enemies. Journalists were enemies, Democrats were enemies, anti-war protesters were enemies, the media was an enemy. Even his own staff came under suspicion. At one point, Nixon seriously discussed using the CIA to interfere with the investigation. Again, casually, like ordering lunch. Meanwhile, the pressure outside mounted. Protesters gathered, editorials grew sharper, trust in the presidency continued to erode. The image of the calm, confident leader had been replaced by something more unsettling, a man trapped by his own secrecy. Then, in October 1973, everything snapped. Nixon ordered the firing of the special prosecutor investigating Watergate. The prosecutor refused to quit. The attorney general refused to fire him. The deputy attorney general refused too. So Nixon fired them all. This event became known as the Saturday Night Massacre, which, despite the name, involved no actual violence, just a rapid-fire collapse of credibility. The public reaction was immediate and brutal. Congress began seriously discussing impeachment, not hypothetically, not as a threat, as a plan. Subpoenas for the tapes intensified. The Supreme Court got involved. Finally, in 1974, the court ruled unanimously that Nixon had to hand over the tapes. No more delays, no more privilege. When the tapes were released, they were bad. Not explosive in a cinematic way, no shouting confessions, no dramatic villain speeches, just the sound of a president calmly agreeing to obstruct justice. The most damning recording, later known as the smoking gun tape, showed Nixon approving a plan to block the FBI's investigation just days after the break-in. It was unmistakable, clear, undeniable. At that moment, Nixon's support collapsed. Republican allies abandoned him. Cabinet members urged resignation. Even his closest defenders quietly stepped away. The math was simple. Impeachment was coming, conviction was likely, and Nixon knew it. In August 1974, standing in the Oval Office, Nixon addressed the nation. His voice was steady, controlled. He announced his resignation, the first and only American president to do so. The next day, he boarded a helicopter and left the White House for the last time. The image is still haunting in its simplicity. A small wave, a quiet exit. No music, no applause. Just a man who had finally run out of places to hide. And yet, even in resignation, Nixon never fully admitted wrongdoing. He spoke of mistakes, of errors in judgment, but not guilt, because for Nixon, admitting fault was worse than losing power. As we gently drift toward what comes next, the aftermath, the pardon, the long shadow Watergate cast on American politics, it's worth sitting with the strangeness of it all. This wasn't a tyrant toppled by revolution. This was a president undone by his own recordings, by his own voice, by his own belief that control mattered more than trust. So take a breath, let that settle. The story isn't over yet. The consequences ripple outward for decades. But for now, the office is empty, the tapes are silent, and Richard Nixon, for the first time in his life, is no longer in charge of anything at all. We'll float onward in the next part. All right, let's settle back in one last time. Same slow pace, same soft glow. The scandal itself is over now. The resignation has happened, the helicopter has lifted off, and the White House, briefly, is very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens after something enormous breaks, and everyone is left standing around, unsure what to touch. Richard Nixon is gone, but Watergate, unfortunately for everyone, is not. The presidency does not stay empty for long. Power, like nature, dislikes a vacuum, and so it falls to Nixon's vice president, Gerald Ford, to step in. Ford was not elected to the presidency. He was not elected vice president either, actually. He had been appointed after Nixon's previous vice president resigned in a completely different scandal, which already tells you a lot about the era. Ford was calm, decent, mild-mannered. He had the general vibe of a man who owned sensible shoes and preferred things not to be on fire. When he addressed the nation, he famously said, "Our long national nightmare is over." This was an optimistic statement because while the nightmare of Nixon himself had ended, the hangover was just beginning. Almost immediately, Ford faced a decision that would define his presidency and permanently split public opinion: what to do about Nixon. The former president had resigned in disgrace, but he had not been charged with a crime. Not yet. And charging him would mean a long, ugly trial. Months, possibly years. A former president in the dock. Every tape replayed. Every wound reopened. Ford decided the country couldn't handle that. So just 1 month after Nixon left office, Ford issued a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes Nixon may have committed while president. No trial, no confession, no consequences. The reaction was swift and furious. Many Americans felt betrayed. They had watched the investigation unfold. They had sat through hearings. They had listened to the tapes. And now, suddenly, it was just over. The man at the center of it all was free to walk away. Ford insisted it was necessary, that the nation needed healing, that dragging Nixon through court would only deepen divisions. And to be fair, he might not have been wrong, but it cost him dearly. His approval ratings collapsed, the pardon haunted his presidency, and many people suspected a secret deal, even though no evidence of one ever emerged. Nixon, meanwhile, retreated from public life. He was deeply depressed. His health suffered. He drank. He wrote. He obsessed over his legacy. For a long time, he was widely hated, a punchline, a cautionary tale. And yet, slowly, something strange happened. Over the years, Nixon re-emerged as a kind of elder statesman. He wrote books on foreign policy, he advised later presidents, he gave interviews, carefully controlled ones. His reputation softened just enough for him to be seen as complicated rather than purely corrupt. Not redeemed, just complicated. But Watergate never loosened its grip on American politics. The scandal fundamentally changed how Americans viewed the presidency. Before Watergate, there was still a lingering belief that the president was, if not noble, at least operating in good faith. After Watergate, that trust was gone, permanently. Congress passed new laws aimed at transparency and accountability, campaign finance rules tightened, oversight increased, journalists became more aggressive, skepticism became the default. And the word gate became a suffix. Every scandal after that was something gate, because Watergate had become the template, the original sin, the moment the illusion cracked. At its core, Watergate wasn't about a break-in. It wasn't even about a cover-up. It was about fear. Fear of losing power, fear of enemies, fear of vulnerability. Nixon's greatest flaw wasn't cruelty or ambition. Plenty of politicians have those. It was his inability to trust anyone. He believed the system was rigged, that the press was hostile, that opposition wasn't legitimate, just dangerous. And so he justified extraordinary actions to protect himself, actions that, in the end, destroyed him. And there's something almost quietly tragic about that. Nixon achieved everything he wanted: the presidency, a landslide re-election, a place in history. And still, it wasn't enough to make him feel safe. So he kept recording, kept scheming, kept tightening his grip until there was nowhere left to hold on. Watergate didn't explode. It didn't shock all at once. It crept. It unfolded slowly, through memos, through testimony, through tape hiss and muffled voices, through the dull machinery of bureaucracy doing exactly what it was designed to do. And maybe that's why it still resonates. There was no dramatic villain monologue, no final showdown, just a man listening to his own voice, realizing too late that it had been telling on him the whole time. Nixon died in 1994. By then, the anger had cooled, the story had settled into textbooks. He was remembered as a disgraced president, yes, but also as a complicated one, capable, intelligent, deeply flawed. But Watergate never loosened its grip on American politics.